Imagine standing in a village square in the year 1750. Someone asks you a simple question. When were you born? You open your mouth to answer, and nothing comes. Not because you're confused. Because you genuinely don't know. Not the day. Not the month. Maybe not even the year, not with certainty. This wasn't rare. For most of human history, across most of the world, the exact date of your birth was not something anyone thought to write down, and if it was written down, it wasn't written down for you. It was written down for someone else's purposes entirely. Then, in the span of a few decades in the 19th century, that started to change. Governments began demanding names, dates, parents, places, paper trails that would follow a person from cradle to grave. Why? And why does the number 1890 keep surfacing in this story? Before we go further, if the hidden machinery behind everyday traditions fascinates you, consider subscribing. This is a story about paperwork. And somehow, it's also a story about who got to count as a person at all. To understand why birthdays weren't tracked, you first have to understand who was allowed to have one. The earliest evidence of birthday-like celebration comes from ancient Egypt, and even there, it wasn't really about a birth date in the way we mean it. Pharaohs marked the day of their coronation as a kind of second birth, the moment a mortal man became a living god. That was the anniversary worth recording, because it mattered for succession, legitimacy, divine authority. The Greeks borrowed the impulse but pointed it at their gods instead of their kings. Moon-shaped honey cakes offered to Artemis, candles lit not to mark a person's age but to send smoke and prayer skyward. It was Rome that took the meaningful next step. For the first time in the historical record, ordinary citizens, specifically free men, had their birthdays acknowledged with feasts, gifts, and family gatherings. Women would wait more than 1,000 years for the same recognition. Picture that imbalance for a moment. An entire civilization capable of aqueducts, law codes, and a functioning postal system, and still, whether your birth was worth marking depended on your gender and your citizenship. This is the pattern that repeats across the old world. Birthdays were a privilege of status, not a right of existence. Kings, popes, nobles, and gods got dates. Everyone else got seasons, harvests, saints' days, approximate time, not exact time. Here's the part that tends to surprise people most. This wasn't just true in the ancient world. It was still true for the vast majority of humanity well into the industrial age. Most people in pre-modern societies lived by agricultural and religious rhythms, not calendars pinned to a wall. A birth might be remembered as around the wheat harvest or the winter the river froze, memory anchored to events, not numbers. Literacy was limited. Written records, where they existed, were fragile, local, and often destroyed by fire, war, or simple neglect. And when a document did exist, it usually wasn't created to celebrate a life. It was created to serve institutions, the crown, the church, the tax collector. This is the uncomfortable center of the story. Birthdays as personal milestones and birth records as bureaucratic tools grew up almost entirely separately from each other, for centuries. One belonged to culture. The other belonged to power. If you're finding this more unsettling than expected, that's usually a sign the story is about to get stranger. Comment below and tell us when you think birthdays became something ordinary people actually knew and celebrated. The earliest systematic attempt to record births in much of Europe didn't come from a government at all. It came from the church. Parish registers, records of baptisms, marriages, and burials, became common across Catholic and later Protestant Europe from around the 16th century onward. In England, parish clergy were formally required to keep such registers starting in the 1530s. These weren't birth certificates in the modern sense. A baptism record noted the date a child was welcomed into the faith, which was usually, though not always, close to the actual birth date. For centuries, This was the closest thing most Europeans had to an official record of existence. If you needed to prove your age, your parentage, or your legitimacy for inheritance, you went to the parish, not the palace. But parish records had serious limits. They only covered those within a particular church's reach. Nonconformists, religious minorities, the very poor, and the geographically isolated often fell outside the system entirely. As populations grew and moved, especially with industrialization pulling families from villages into fast-growing cities, church-based tracking increasingly failed to keep pace. Something more centralized was coming. And it wasn't going to be about faith. It was going to be about numbers. Now we reach the century where the real transformation happens, and where the story resists a single, tidy date. Civil registration, meaning government record-keeping of birth separate from any church, first appeared in a serious, centralized form in France in the late 18th century, in the wake of the Revolution. England and Wales followed with the Births and Deaths Registration Act, which brought civil registration into force on the 1st of July, 1837, establishing the General Register Office and, for the first time, a national, secular system for recording every birth, marriage, and death in the country. Scotland adopted its own system in 1855, Ireland in 1864. Notice something already. None of those pivotal dates is 1890. And the pattern holds elsewhere. The United States never had a single unifying moment at all. Individual states adopted civil registration at wildly different times throughout the second half of the 19th century and well into the 20th. Some cities recorded vital statistics as early as the 1840s, while many rural areas had no reliable system until after 1900. A national, standardized push in the US didn't really take hold until the early 20th century, and full compliance across all states wasn't achieved until 1933. Even where laws existed on paper, enforcement often lagged for decades. In England, registration wasn't even made compulsory until 1875, nearly 40 years after the system began, because early participation was inconsistent enough that a meaningful percentage of births went unrecorded. So did anything specific happen around 1890? Something did, though it's more of a convergence than a single decree. By the 1880s and 1890s, a cluster of pressures was reaching a tipping point across industrializing nations: explosive urban population growth, mass immigration into cities and across the Atlantic, the rise of public health science tracking disease and mortality, and early labor reform movements trying to determine who was actually a child. These forces pushed many governments, and many individual American states in particular, toward tighter, more consistent birth documentation in that general window. But it was an acceleration of an existing trend, not a single invented starting line. So why did the powerful suddenly care so much about the birth dates of ordinary people? The reasons are less mysterious than the framing suggests, but no less consequential. Taxation came first, historically. Knowing who existed, and how many of them there were, was essential to knowing what a state could extract in revenue. Inheritance and property law required proof of legitimate birth and parentage, who could rightfully claim land, titles, or family wealth. Military conscription became an enormous driver in the 19th century especially. An industrializing state building a modern army needed to know precisely how many young men existed, and precisely when they'd turn 18. A birth record was the difference between an army raised on guesswork and one raised on certainty. Citizenship and immigration control intensified as borders hardened and nations began distinguishing insiders from outsiders in bureaucratic terms. A birth certificate became proof of belonging. Public education systems, expanding rapidly in this era, needed to know which children were of school age. And Public Health Administration needed birth and death data to track epidemics and infant mortality, arguably one of the strongest and most benevolent motivations behind the whole system. None of this was really about you, the individual, and your cake and candles. It was about the state seeing its population clearly enough to tax it, conscript it, educate it, and govern it. The birthday party came along for the ride, almost as an accident of bureaucracy.
If that reframes the whole idea of a birthday for you, you're not alone. Leave a like if you want more of these buried historical mechanics. So let's return to the claim in the title, that the old world never celebrated birthdays, and that government started tracking them in 1890. Both halves need correction. The old world did celebrate birthdays, just selectively, and mostly for gods, monarchs, and eventually free male citizens, long before the modern era. What the old world lacked wasn't the concept of a birthday. It lacked a universal infrastructure for ordinary people to know, prove, or celebrate their own exact birth date with any reliability. And 1890 was not a starting gun. It wasn't the year civil registration began, that was decades earlier in most of Europe. It wasn't the year the United States achieved full registration, that took until the 1930s. What 1890 does represent, roughly, is a period when several separate historical currents, urbanization, immigration, labor reform, public health, and state bureaucracy, converged hard enough that birth documentation went from patchy and optional in practice to something increasingly expected in many Western nations within a couple of decades on either side of that year. The true story isn't a single dramatic reveal. It's slower, messier, and in some ways more interesting, a 200-year drift from church ledgers to state paperwork, driven not by any interest in celebration, but by taxation, war, and control, with the birthday party quietly riding along in the paperwork's shadow. Think about what it means that most of your ancestors, for almost the entirety of human history, lived and died without ever knowing, with certainty, the exact day they entered the world. Not because it didn't matter to them. Because no one in power needed it to matter. And then think about what it means that the moment a state finally needed to count you, measure you, tax you, and conscript you, that was the moment your birthday became official. Perhaps the question was never why they started counting birthdays. Perhaps the real question is why humans suddenly needed every life measured, recorded, and remembered, and whether the candle on your cake was ever really about you at all.